Hello, and welcome to Pride in Progress, our conversation series for Pride Month over here on LGBTQ Victory Institute's social media channels. This is a series that we're putting on to sort of educate our audience and our supporters about different moments in LGBTQ history that really continue to inspire the community in our current activism. And we are kicking off the series today with a very special guest, Honey Mahogany, who is here to talk to us about the Comptons Cafeteria riots of 1966. You may know Honey from season 5 of Drag Race. Honey is also well known as an activist in San Francisco. She's active in San Francisco politics and is currently running for chair of the and you can correct me if I get this wrong, the San Francisco Central Democratic Committee. She's also a co-founder of the Comptons Transgender Cultural District, which is a first of its kind cultural district dedicated to the transgender community anywhere in the world. And it's right there in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, where the events that we'll be talking about today took place. So without further ado, let me bring on Honey. Hi, Honey.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. We couldn't think of a better topic and a better expert to have on, given how involved you are in making sure that this story gets out there. So first, let's talk a little bit about how you got involved in, and like I said, getting the story out there.
I guess for me, it wasn't so much about the riots that I was interested in, but it was really for me about protecting my community and preventing the continued displacement of, people of color but specifically also LGBT, trans and LGB and trans people from one of San Francisco's most diverse, most culturally rich, and also poorest neighborhoods, which is the Tenderloin. And I was working as a social worker at that time in the East Bay. And we were seeing, a tremendous amount of people displaced further and further out there, which had extremely negative consequences and really became sort of a life or death issue for folks. And so, this was also just a part of the larger conversation of gentrification and, what that means for communities that have historically been disenfranchised and haven't had a seat at the table, and figuring out how we can actually fight to have a seat at that table, and make improvements for our communities, have our cities change, but still preserve the history of those spaces, and also I think just preserve the integrity of our neighborhoods, right? I mean, because there's a reason that people come to San Francisco. Many folks come here to find themselves, to seek protection. It is a sanctuary city in many ways. And, to see that, the ability for folks to come here seeking sanctuary eroded was really painful for me as someone who was born and raised here and whose family came here as political refugees. So that's why I got involved. And then, the history of the Comptons Cafeteria riot was something I learned later, as we were sort of fighting gentrification and looking for ways in which to preserve our communities. We learned about this thing that happened in 1966, which was 3 years before Stonewall. It is actually the first documented collective uprising of LGBT people in this country, and I think a lot of people hadn't heard about it, but it's and there, I will say that there were also other riots or uprisings that happened in the 60s prior to Stonewall. But I think it's important to shine a light, right, on all of these things that have happened, because as we know, a lot of our history is lost, right, because people don't concentrate on the history of those communities that are disenfranchised, of the little guy. They never tell that side of the story. And so we're now just sort of starting to uncover a lot of these pieces of our history.
Yes, it is. It is really interesting. The more I have researched this topic in particular, the more of those sort of pre-Stonewall instances I run into, whether it's sort of the more respectable looking protests that Frank Kameny did, or the the donut riots of earlier in this in 1959, I believe. There's so many of those instances, and I think it's a really fascinating time in history that we're able to look back at some of those now and recognize, hey, this didn't all start in New York. It didn't all start even in the 60s. But yes, you were talking a little bit about the Tenderloin, and I'm wondering, I imagine it's a very different sort of place today than it was in the mid 60s. But can you kind of take us back? What was the scene?
Sure. I will say that the Tenderloin is changing, but in many ways it is, I think, probably similar to a certain extent to how it was in the 60s. The Tenderloin during the 60s was a low-income transient neighborhood. And, it was called the Tenderloin because it was actually a name that was given to it by the police. Because, at that time, there was a lot of money to be made by extortion by the police. And so they would basically extort local businesses, but they made the most money off of those businesses that were either operating illegally or doing certain things that were, not allowed. And they would sort of allow them to continue operating as long as they were getting a cut. And so, and this then takes our conversation even further back than the 60s to sort of how the Tenderloin was created as a vice district. And, it actually goes back to the sort of the founding of our city during the gold rush and the expansion west, and also the all the people that came to the U.S. as a part of the gold rush, including, the Chinese. And when the Chinese first came here, they faced a lot of oppression. I mean, obviously there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and there was a lot of discrimination. But Chinese people were not allowed, or people of Asian descent were not allowed to own property, were not allowed to really participate in the economy in general. We're allowed to have certain jobs or hold jobs or all those things. And so in order to make a living for themselves around, outside of, actually searching for gold, they ended up setting up a vice district because there was a lot of money to be made there, and from, the selling of, drugs and opium and, sex work. All of those things were very, very lucrative. And the Chinese community soon became, flush with money, or at least certain people did. And so at the time, a lot of the, white settlers were like, well, we should be making money on this kind of stuff. And so they set up another neighborhood, the Tenderloin, where that was basically, the white version of what later became Chinatown. So that is what established the Tenderloin as this vice district, an area where things that were not allowed in different parts of the city were allowed. That is everything from drug dealing to gambling to drinking during Prohibition, sex work. And it also applied to, people who were, I guess, at the time considered cross-dressing, because we didn't have, really the term transgender at that time. We didn't have, and drag queen wasn't really a common term either. I mean, and I think there was less of a distinction between the two. At the time, there were what we called public decency laws, which basically really policed the ways in which people appeared in public. And it was used to discriminate against people who were deemed unsightly. And that could be someone who was disabled or disfigured, but also for people who were outside of the, the norms of gender. So, if you were someone who was assigned male at birth and then were found to be wearing women's clothing, that was a breach of public decency laws, and you could be arrested and jailed. Well, that rule didn't apply quite as staunchly in the Tenderloin, like many other rules. And, people were allowed to be a little more free and, more queer and more trans in the Tenderloin. And they were also, allowed to engage in sex work in the Tenderloin. So that's basically how the Tenderloin became really San Francisco's first LGBT neighborhood. The Tenderloin and the Lower Polk were basically the Castro of the 60s before there was a Castro. And so, that's why we have so many historical sites, LGBT sites within the Tenderloin. It's probably one of the densest, the neighborhood with the densest amount of LGBT businesses and sites specific to the LGBT community in the city and potentially the country. And it was fittingly the home of the Comptons Cafeteria Riots.
Great, let's get into it. And way to set the scene. I didn't even know that the Tenderloin was modeled after what became Chinatown. That's very, very interesting. What kind of place was Compton's, Gene Compton's Cafeteria?
Well, back in the day, there weren't really cell phones, and there also, for many people, especially in the Tenderloin and lower income neighborhoods, people didn't even have necessarily access to phones. And so the ways in which that they would be able to, communicate, check in on each other, and was really to meet up at a spot. And the Comptons Cafeteria was an all-night eatery. It was a place very central in the Tenderloin. And a lot of people, after being at the bar or after, being out on the stroll or whatever, would go to Compton's, which was actually a chain restaurant. But they would go to the Compton's in the Tenderloin to just, grab a cup of coffee and a bite, and also to just sort of catch up with one another. And, I think that there are various stories about how, the owner of Compton's, whether or not he was friendly towards the LGBT community, or just sort of begrudgingly put up with people of the LGBT community being there because they were paying customers. But, at the end of the day, it was a space that people used to have these social interactions and, basically check in with their queer families. So it was an all-night diner, greasy, but, very much of its time. So not necessarily a gay-owned bar, place that was,
right.
Super, super welcoming all the time. The cops would come in and harass people periodically, and but it was maybe as safe as things got in a public space.
It seemed like it was sort of geographically situated in just the right area to catch people from the different popular spots, and the fact that it was open 24/7,
yes,
obviously was helpful.
Totally.
You alluded to some terminology that's changed over the last 5 decades, which is a natural thing in language, but I think with gender identity and sexual orientation, something that might happen faster now that the more we come to understand about ourselves. But what were sort of the types? How did the folks who were in the Tenderloin, who would the types of folks who would be at Compton's, how would they identify? What were you talking about gay people? Were you talking about trans people? And what were some of the terms in use?
I mean, I think it was all of the above. I don't know actually what terms were in use. I'm not to be clear, I'm not a historian. I'm just someone who's, read a lot about the history, and but I don't know to that extent, like what terms people were using back then. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes. I don't think I quite know either, which is it's one of those things that always seems to be changing, and you read one book and then you read a different book and it's a totally different sort of terminology being used. So just thought I would pick your brain there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were all different types of people who were going there. I think that but a lot of them were probably, uh, very queer, and probably, visibly queer, and probably didn't. Well, actually, maybe they called themselves queer back then. I'm sure they called themselves lots of different things, but I do know that there were some folks there who were drag queens for sure. I do know that there were people who were there who, lived as women, and but maybe didn't have the language around, being transgender. Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a very wide variety of stories that were told, and lives that were lived in the Tenderloin.
Let's get into what happened. What exactly happened in August? We say August of 1966 because I don't think we know the exact date.
Yeah. There is not an exact date, but they kind of know that it happened. Supposedly. Well, actually, Susan Stryker is someone who should bring on here because she's the one who uncovered all of this history in her research of the LGBT. Just the history of San Francisco. But she kind of told me that when she was doing her research, she found these references to this riot. But that, one of the people who was sort of like writing about their memories of the riot was actually also, there was another riot that happened around the same time in the Bayview. And they happened maybe about a month or so apart. One happened, I think, in like perhaps in August, and then the other happened in September or October. And she thinks that this person was remembering the Bayview riot because it happened in October, late September. And at that time, that's when San Francisco usually gets hot. And in his sort of memoirs or in his writings, in his reports, he talks about it being a hot late summer night. But those of us in San Francisco know that oftentimes it is not hot at night during the summer. But in September and October, we do get like this late summer heat wave. So what happened that night was that basically there were, it was dinner as usual with people chatting and having coffee and eating and catching up. And a police officer came in to the establishment, maybe was trying to get money from the owner, and was basically starting to harass people. And at some point, this one drag queen had enough, and she decided to throw her coffee in his face, the police officer's face. And then, people started throwing salt shakers and, chairs, and, there was just a riot that sort of burst out of that moment and lasted at least another whole day in the streets of the Tenderloin. So it was pretty, it was started by the police again.
A very familiar theme, past and present. Yes. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward, right? You get harassed someone, you harassed the wrong queen, and there was some fighting that ensued. But then the story was kind of lost to time. It didn't really receive media coverage. There's obviously some living witnesses that are still around, thank God. And that's part of the reason I think Stryker was able to find some of that information. But it's complicated, but is there a legacy here? Like what happened after Comptons in the immediate aftermath, and then after we've sort of unearthed the story again, like how are people looking to this moment in history for inspiration?
Well, I mean, I think that part of the reason maybe, and this is something that Susan has said, is that Comptons didn't get more attention is because, there wasn't really, I think it was sort of the lead up to the pinnacle of the civil rights movement. It was maybe the fomention of the civil rights movement. But I think, in 1969, that was really at the head of when all of, like, there was this it was a boiling point, right? And following, I think, the Stonewall riots, there was sort of, number one, there was national attention around it for a variety of reasons, maybe because Judy Garland had just died or, whatever. But there were so many just things happening at that time, and it was such a big year that I think the momentum had built, and the 1969 Stonewall riots just I think it happened at the right time to sort of, like many other things, like it was the right place, right time, right moment, and was highlighted. And subsequently there were more and more things that happened after that. And I think with the 1966 Comptons Cafeteria riots, there was this uprising, and then, it was kind of a little bit of back to normal and kind of quiet. And so I think that's why it got lost to history. But when I say quiet, I don't mean that nothing was happening. I think people were, upset, and people were organizing and doing things, but it just maybe wasn't as in loud of a way as, continuous rioting. Coming out of the Comptons Cafeteria riots, groups like Vanguard who were involved, ended up founding Glide Memorial Church, which is, an amazing nonprofit and church in San Francisco that provides, tons and tons and tons of social services, and has an amazing gospel choir, and does incredible services that people of all faiths and denominations go to. So, there were, I think, a lot of things that, came out of that event, including, setting the stage for us to have, one of the first openly gay man, serving on a board of supervisors, Harvey Milk. So I think there were a lot of things that eventually came to San Francisco because of that, ferocity and that, that fighting spirit, and, the groundwork that was laid by those at the Comptons Cafeteria riots. But I do think that there was a little bit of an ebb and a flow to the action.
I would like to speed up to present day and talk about some of the amazing work you are doing in San Francisco with the district. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what motivated you to start the district, and what some of the things that you're doing over there?
Sure. Again, like, the reason that we started the district was really to prevent the continued displacement of folks from San Francisco. San Francisco is, arguably the most expensive city to live in the world. And it's always been, I guess, expensive, relatively speaking, but it's never been this extreme. And again, people used to be able to come here seeking sanctuary, a place where, one could raise a family or move here with nothing and make something of yourself and your life, a place where people came to be accepted and to discover themselves in many ways. More and more I was seeing, as someone who, again, grew up here, but also was very active in the queer scene, both as a drag queen and as an activist, seeing a lot of my friends be pushed out of the city, and moved to places, at first it was, places that were, very different, like, Austin or Portland. And then it became even to places like Los Angeles and New York, because those were more affordable. And it just was heartbreaking to me that people could not pay rent in San Francisco, even though they were holding down one, sometimes two jobs. And especially for those people who, were most vulnerable, for trans people of color, we were seeing people that were living in subsidized housing displaced out of the city, which then put them at risk for not being able to access services, definitely not jobs, and then that led to really some serious, decompensation, and it became a life and death situation for many people. And so I got involved to stem the tide of displacement and to figure out how we could, preserve affordability within San Francisco and specifically within the Tenderloin, and then also really prevent the displacement of queer and trans people from the Tenderloin. There in San Francisco, we, former supervisor David Campos had established these things called cultural districts, which were basically community, based organizations that worked with the existing communities to, again, prevent displacement in a variety of ways, but also to really celebrate the cultural dynamics, the cultural history and legacy of these neighborhoods. So building on that work, we worked a collection of, some of the pre-established cultural districts, as well as, this new cultural district that we were trying to start for the Tenderloin. Were able to, pass legislation that officially recognized these, neighborhoods, these cultural districts in the city charter, and imbued them with certain, rights. And then also were able to pass a ballot measure which helped to fund this work. And so we founded also the, and we founded the Transgender Cultural District. At the time, it was called the Comptons Transgender Cultural District, after the Comptons Cafeteria Riot, right in the heart of the Tenderloin, with the Comptons Cafeteria Riot site being basically the pinnacle of it. And we really based it on where we saw, LGBT cultural assets in the Tenderloin, both historically and ones that were currently still around. And it has been definitely a wild ride. I was there when, leading the cultural district, when there was no funding, and when we didn't really know how to do anything. And we were able to secure funding, and and now, the cultural district has, I believe, 6 employees, including the executive director, and all these different programs. They are doing, certainly anti-displacement work and providing housing subsidies for their housing program to keep trans people housed in San Francisco. They've got a entrepreneurship program that they have put, several folks through, and provided seed funding for business ideas. They have a visual storytelling project telling the stories of trans people's lived experience in San Francisco and the Tenderloin specifically. They do several cultural celebrations and events, and also have done an awareness campaign in partnership with various groups, but also just specifically on behalf of the Trans Cultural District. So it's been, and they've also, started actually talking with folks in other cities on how they can do this work and replicate this work elsewhere. So it's become, I think, everything we dreamed it would be, which is, again, preventing displacement, providing job opportunities for trans people and entrepreneurship opportunities, providing housing, celebrating culture, doing placemaking throughout the district, and then also, of course, honoring the history and preserving that history for future generations.
That is so amazing. And that work is so badass. And I hope there are several other transgender cultural districts coming soon to a town near me.
Where are you?
I'm in DC, so the other really expensive real estate market in the country. I can definitely empathize with those woes. Honey, it's been so great having you on to talk to us about this incredible story and this incredible legacy. Where can people find out more information about the riots and about the district?
Well, I believe you can go to the district's. Well, if you want to learn more about the riots, you can check out Screaming Queens, which is Dr. Susan Stryker's documentary. I believe it's available for free on YouTube. And then to learn more about the transgender district, you can go to transgenderdistrictsf.com. That is where you will, there's a whole about section where you can learn about the district. And then it also talks about all their programs and events and upcoming events that they have. So I would definitely check that out.
Well, Honey Mahogany, thank you so much for coming on to Pride in Progress. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely.